We've set the scene for our edition. Let's start with the first session of Forum Pulire 2020 devoted to women. Given that Forum Pulire has always dealt with current affairs, and before leaving the floor to Professor Sapelli, who has always been a dear friend, I'd like to introduce his speech. You brought us stories of women, different women, and you'll tell us what women represented internationally. Before starting to deal with this topic, let's talk about current affairs. First, we've been witnessing to a worsening of the pandemic, not only in Italy, but across the world, and this generates plenty of concerns and preoccupations, but also it originates questions about our economic resilience, because in Europe we still have the discussion on the next generation EU or the recovery fund. This money hasn't been allocated yet, but people are wondering whether the European governance should be reconsidered to focus on these instruments. So this is something very complicated. I'd like to hear from Professor Sapelli about this in the light of the pandemic, in the light of new outbreaks, in the light of Europe that seems very stringent about economic affairs. What should we be expecting?
Well, thank you for your question. That's better to say what we would have expected, because what you mentioned is that this is a period of great complexity, and both politicians and public just acknowledge or realize now how this fund is complicated, which is complicated to allocate it. So the first to state something without any extreme statement was Mr. Gentiloni, Commissioner Gentiloni, and it is the director generals that depend on the vice presidents. Should our commissioner address director general to accelerate the themes you hinted at, he should address the vice presidency. But there is an underlying problem, given that we are faced with a pandemic, a catastrophic event. What is disquieting is that Article 122 of the treaty after Lisbon 2010, in case of catastrophe, all measures taken to stem these catastrophic events can be taken irrespective of rules. And I limit myself to remind you of Professor Magno, full professor at Cattolica University, and we have often times asked that this provision was taken into consideration. The individual member state have already approved recovery plans at a national level, such as France, for instance. France was the country that tried to change the European model to raise capital on the market, and this money are not coming from the European budget, because this is something not accurate. They will never get from the European budget. This money will come from the setting up of a special purpose vehicle, and 27 member states will need to vote on its regulations, and only then it will be presented to the international market, and then the money will be raised. So what is being said is something very inaccurate, and instead we could settle things by resorting to a national credit. And this was suggested by Emeritus President of Intesa San Paolo, who said, let's do what we did in 1948, when there was a reconstruction loan that was put together, and then we have a surplus, cash surplus, irrespective of the problems that we have taxation-wise. Still we could resort to this cash surplus. The scant quality of Italian politicians or managers, also those in Confindustria, so they always complain but do very little. And we should not forget that what we were supposed to do, we didn't do.
Vediamo, insomma, se quando arriveranno i soldi europei, vediamo se
We'll
appunto
see when the European
c'è una
money
forte
will be
concretezza delle questioni, non solo si vede
allocated,
l'esistenza effettiva
and
di quel monte, professor Sapelli, però la
also
domanda successiva è questa, in parte
the
lo stava
following
accennando il professor
question
Sapelli, cioè
is
con questa
this
mole di
one. You
denaro
hinted at it
cosa
already.
siamo in grado di
Given
fare?
what
Cioè
can we
abbiamo una
do with
visione, abbiamo
this
degli
huge
scenari,
amount
sappiamo
of
quali sono le
money?
cose da
Have we
prendere
got
col pugno?
scenarios that have been outlined? What could we do immediately? The only thing we are aware of was not defined by Parliament, but the Colau task force, which is an executive committee set up by the government. There are all set of initiatives that have been outlined, but all what is done should start from what we need. And again, this task force outlined just cues, hints, but we have problems from our mobility perspective. For instance, suffice to think of what happened in Liguria, the Morandi Bridge that collapsed, the roads that are all inaccessible, and not to mention Sicily. They are telling us that they want to build an underground, the sea tunnel to go to Sicily, but in Sicily we do not yet have motorway. Have you ever gone to airports in Calabria, Reggio Calabria? That's not acceptable. Airport in Italy, Alitalia is crumbling into pieces. I wish it can recover, and Francesco Caio, the new president, can definitely support the airline, but everything has to be reconstructed in Italy. And as to the investment on digital connections, we should be very cautious, because this thing here created um, a society of entertainment, but hasn't increased our productivity. It decreased the productivity of employees. So when we talk about digital investment, um, well, uh, something that we should be getting from the space. It is not a coincidence that the United States are much ahead of us, are planning trips to Mars. Of course, they are not planning to land on Mars, but all innovation is coming from the space in the future. AI will come from the conquest of the space, and the only good thing that this government did was Vice Minister Fraccar that signed an agreement with United States. NAS. So digital investment cannot be, it must not be used just for entertainment, but to increase our um,
Allora,
our
questo
productivity.
sì.
And allow me to say also this, we also have European funds that we haven't spent yet. So we should be putting together networks capable of investing this money, because we have 100 billion uh, euro that haven't been spent yet. They have been planned, so to say. The investment has been planned, but they haven't been actually spent. And Mr. Cottavelli spoke about much less money than what has been anticipated. Let's not mislead society. And one just another question on Italy, and then we'll try and project outside Italy. Isn't it an alibi to say that the bureaucracy or red tape stops everything? Well, politics doesn't exist today, unfortunately. The one we thought of, a community of destiny, a community of people and men that share destiny. They have a purpose, they have a target, they set up a party, a task force. Today, we do not have a public opinion that is formed. There is no longer a political discussion, and I must say that the core of the crux of the problem is the legal framework that we have given to ourselves. We took the Civil Code of France, but without having the French state. We have an order that turned into power, such as the judicial order that turned into judicial power. And if politics no longer has its agora, parliament, because we cannot go on with the prime minister decrees, moves elsewhere. So the new powers are these structures which stop everything. And I close. We also have this concept of negative anthropology. I watch television the least I can, of course, if except movies, and I hear that the world around us is full of thieves, of corrupted people, but instead we are surrounded, I am surrounded by good guys. What I mean is that this negative anthropology is leading us to ruin. We have to be more trustful, more confident. We have to open ourselves to others. And this is the actual battle we must fight, a cultural one. Forum Pulire in a way, was organized because of this to develop trust among people who are often forgotten, both technologically and from a perspective of physical performance that is always done with great intelligence. So we must develop trust. So Forum Pulire also should be setting a world of positive anthropology. Professor
Potrei una
Sapelli,
discussione anche sul ruolo dei mass media, dei mezzi di comunicazione, di TV, giornali, tutto,
we
ma questo
could
è un altro
discuss
capitolo.
the role of
Invece,
mass media as
prima
well, but
di
this is
venire
another
alla
chapter. Before
testimonianza,
coming to
femminile da parte del
this
professor
witness
Sapelli,
on
una domanda che direi anche questa di stretta
the
attualità che riguarda le
women
elezioni prossime del
universe,
giugno negli Stati
I'd like
Uniti.
to ask a question
Trump
about
ha
the
sconfitto a suo dire il
elections in
virus,
the
si
United
presenta
States.
nuovamente
Trump
invincibile, deve recuperare
defeated
forse secondo le ultime
the
sondaggi almeno 10
coronavirus. He
punti
has
sullo
to recover
sfidante
at least 10
Biden.
points
È chiaro che dalle
versus
elezioni statunitensi
Biden.
dipendono gli
Clearly
equilibri
enough,
politici ed economici del
all
mondo. Come
geopolitical
va
and
la finta, professor
economic
Sapelli?
situations in the world depend on the US election. This is a very interesting topic because it goes back to one aspect that I anticipated before. In the United States, too, politics is dying. It is being replaced by people like Trump. But in the United States, we still have political parties. We have a lot of money there. There are conflicting interests, but there is a mass political party, people who volunteer to foster the campaign of these candidates. So in the United States, we still have that because the United States is a democracy. This is no longer true for Europe. And I am bemused by this appeal to the rule of law, but there is no rule of law. Now you're asking me who is going to win in the United States. To a certain extent, I would say the situation is less tragic than it was some months ago because the establishment discovered and understood that the challenge is to put together a new Cold War against China. For the establishment network of the great families such as Clinton and Bush families that relied on the financial industry and that allowed China to enter WTO, and this is the most dangerous thing that was done in human history. And then we're talking about the rule of law, and still this country is jailing people for their opinion. Now it has been understood that this war will also be on a military level. We have to invest more on aircrafts and ships. So this is a technological change that is to be put in place. And again, this comes from space, and this technological war will take place in the Pacific Ocean, and the United States should find an agreement with Russia because if there are fights between two great powers, all small powers or countries such as Turkey think they can do anything they like. But what will be crucial or key is whether the people who would have voted for Sanders will still vote for Biden. The campaign by Biden is in a way controlled by financial powers. And then we have Trump, who is the representation of the absolute king, but he is in a way uh, well understanding what the world should be doing, fighting China and aiming at strengthening the manufacturing industry. But in the between, we have millennials. 70% of them want socialism. They want brotherhood. They want community. They want to work. They want to eliminate unemployment. They don't want to get any aid or wages, minimum wages. Will they vote then for Biden or will they abstain? Well, if they abstain, Trump will win again, and this is dangerous. If they go and vote, Biden will win. And this is even more painful because Trump already announced that he will do anything in his powers to extend his presidency. He won't accept the outcome. So the world is moving towards its end, and this is what has been achieved by the recent neoliberalism. To understand what has been going on in the United States, you should remember that 20 years ago, and this is true for Africa as a whole, for instance, to attend the elementary schools in Africa, you have to pay. There is no longer state school in Africa, for instance. So the Afro-American world is not living separated from Africa. These riots and protests do not just um, stem from the US situation, but they stem from a world situation. Then, of course, there are tribes in Africa, but they actually account for states, for nations. So the situation is much more complicated, and this situation is rooted in the neoliberalism of the past years, and this is reflected in the current US campaigns. This has to do with the example of the black swans. It's not that everything starts from the United States and then goes to Africa. Thank you, Professor Sapelli.
Questa incursione
This
nell'attualità
raid
attraverso questa grande
into
occasione, questa
topical
conferma anche di quanto il forum
subjects was
sia un grande
inevitable, and this is a
pensatorio, no? Un grande simbolo
confirmation
di
of
grandi
how
di
Forum
questioni. Veniamo
Pulire is a great
alla
think tank.
sessione, la prima di
And
stamattina
let's
dedicata
come
alle
to
donne,
today's first
ricordandoci
session
sempre,
devoted
sottolineando
to
come il
women,
70% degli
underlying
operatori
that more
dei servizi
70%
integrati
of
della pulizia
workers of
professionale sono
integrated
donne. Abbiamo
services,
voluto
professional
appunto
cleaning
cominciare con
services
questo
is
tema
women.
che
Wanted to
sarà
start with this
raccontato,
topic,
che sarà
which will
testimoniato
be in a way
dal professor
narrated
Sapelli, ma
by
attenzione perché
Professor
scopriremo
Sapelli first,
durante la
and
mattinata
we'll
molto
discover
diverse tra loro
during the
per
morning session
ruoli,
that
per
this will also be
responsabilità,
narrated
per
by people who have
Professor
attenzione
Sapelli,
different
I know
roles
that
in
you
their
chose
lives,
three
different
different
jobs and
women.
professor Sapelli.
The
professions.
floor is yours. I was deeply struck by the decision that Tony D'Andrea, my dear friend, took to open with this topic of women, which is key in the cultural landscape. And so I tried to look inside my heart when speaking about women. Of course, this is a very intimate sphere, and the first woman I think of is Saint Mary Therese Didier. She was a saint. She is a saint, and she belonged to the order of Carmelitans. She died when, at the end of the 19th century, her parents were French Catholics. In 1905, there was a law whereby all the churches do not belong to the church, the buildings do not belong to the church but to the state. So it was difficult to be a Catholic in France. In Italy, this is unknown. Anyway, Saint Therese of Didieu became a nun when she was very young. When she died, after a long life of disease and difficulties, her diaries were discovered, and she became a protagonist of the French cultural life. Bergson fell in love with her. Freud devoted pages to her. She wrote about theater or theology. It was a different approach to theology. Saint Catherine also wrote about theology, and she fought noblemen. But Saint Therese wrote about the expression of fidelity to God through sanctity in daily small things. So she always was a reference point to me. This attention being paid to the others, and this was the secret of the Carmelitan order, this faith in prayers. And this is the strength of Christianity, of a certain Catholicism that we have forgotten, unfortunately, today. Another woman that was very important to me is Angela Davis. Angela Davis was born 3 years before I was born. She's still alive, and she was one of the world protagonists of the women's lib. She was a militant of the Communist Party. She was a pupil of Marcuse. She had an importance because she fought for women, and she also fought for Americans in the United States, and she was a great barrier to prevent under very difficult circumstances, and she was, for instance, put in jail because she was charged to arm the Black Panthers. So she, as I said, was jailed, but the greatness of the US court system based on common law, which is very respectful of human beings. She was released from prison, and again, as I said, she prevented these two women's lib and the Afro-American movement to fall in the hands of the radicals. She became a famous anthropologist, and from being a militant, she became a professor, university professor, but still plenty of candor was to be seen in her. Lastly, last but not least, better, Benji. She has been helping us for the past 30 years. She has been helping us. She's paying attention to me. She won't be attracted by money. She's loyal to us. She could grow two wonderful children. She supported her husband, who works in cleaning too, and he's a very dignified man, and I recognized in them this dignity of work. When I was young, I met Friedman in Calabria, an anthropologist studying poverty in Calabria, and he taught me how poverty could generate very dignified men. And Mrs. Benji is our cleaning lady, and she has built her own world. One of her children is a chef, another one is studying engineering, and she's one of those women who can accompany you in life. And this again has to do with great purity, because being pure, being honest, means to have a compass in your life to guide you, and this in every single action of our life, and this also relates to how we relate with others. So this is my experience with great women. Hopefully I was not boring, and hopefully also I was not too topical.
Ecco, mi piacerebbe sul
Before
finale,
closing, though,
prima
I'd
di
like to ask
proseguire la
another
nostra
couple of questions. The first
mattinata,
one,
di scrupuliarti con due
by
cose
this
finali, se me lo
last
permetti.
story,
La
your
prima è
objective,
in fondo
we
il
gathered,
racconto di
was to
quest'ultima
focus
donna
on the humble. This is a
in
much
modo
neglected
inclusive, no?
world,
Che è
if
un
not when
mondo
we
molto
discuss
dimenticato,
to
molto
what an
spesso non quando
extent
si
the
fanno
gap
grandi
between the rich
discussioni,
and the
grandi confronti
poor
su
has
quanto nel
widened,
mondo
etc.
si stia allargando il solco, no? Si allarghino le diseguaglianze tra i
What
ricchi
is the recipe you
e i
would give
poveri.
us to try and be
Che
more
ricetta
focused
daresti
on the
per avere i
humble,
radar,
on the
come
poor?
dire, più concentrati su tutto questo?
Well, this recipe stems from the way in which I grew up, in which I was educated, not because my family was a family of factory workers, not because I attended a school at night, but because when I was working for Olivetti, I was paid an extra amount of money to allow me to attend university in Turin. So all the young people who were willing to study at the university, an extra amount of money was paid in the wage. And also because what I see around me, mainly in Milan, but also other European or world cities, is of a segregated world. I was born in an old building in Milan where mostly the poor lived, but just across the street there was a building of rich people. And today, this is what could allow a society to move ahead. Today, we are living in ghettos in a very much segregated manner. Before, we were relying on the church to get this, let's say, mixture before there were the parties, but this is no longer so. So we should be focusing on what Jesus Christ told us, let the humble come to me. And today we are sort of ashamed of speaking about the humble, the poor. People are ashamed even of stating their own faith, and this is the real problem. We cannot reconstruct, rebuild a society unless we are loyal to ourselves, unless young people are spiritually and morally educated. We should be abolishing MBAs and organizing classes of theology and morality. Very
Un'ultima
last
cosa che ti
thing I'd
chiedo
like to
salutandoti
ask you.
è
You
tu hai voluto
underlined
sottolineare che sei
that
stato con le tue testimonianze
you
di queste
wanted
tre
to
donne
be
in
not
attuale.
topical
Se
with
dovessi
these
pensare a una
three
donna
women
attuale,
stories. What
chi
about a
penseresti?
more topical woman? Well, if I have to think of current women, my opinion would be a negative one. Given that I do not want to be
Grazie
negative,
a
I
Giulio
want to
Sapelli,
be
grazie
mentioning current women. Thank
alla sua
you to
alla sua
Professor
testimonianza, al suo
Sapelli. Thank you
contributo.
for his contribution. We
Lo
would
salutiamo e
like
lo
to
ringraziamo
thank
ovviamente
him. We are
specifiche
happy
per
he
l'appunto
was with us
anche
also
per
for
questa
the
edizione del
Forum
Forum
Pulire
Pulire
2020
2020.
edition,
Noi
and
ci
we'll
vediamo
be
tra
meeting
pochissimo,
soon
Luca
with
Barbareschi.
Luca Barbareschi.